Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar on GDPR. We will just give some people a little bit of time to join us. I still see people coming in, and we'll start in about 30 seconds. All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Sasha. I'm Marketing Manager here at Withum, and thank you for joining us today to our webinar, Introduction to GDPR. We'll talk about what it is, how it will affect your business, and how to stay compliant. I will just mention a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar. We'll be sending out a link to the presentation, a link to the recording later on today. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them in the questions pane of the GoToWebinar panel. We will address the questions at the end, but please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar. And just as a reminder, this is a CPE credit webinar. In order to receive the CPE credit, please make sure you participate in the polls. There's also an evaluation form at the end, which is optional, but if you have the time, please participate in that as well. So with that, I will kick it off to Daniel, who's joining me here along with Anupam. So Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Cohen-Dumani. I am a partner here at Withum and market leader of our Withum digital practice, which is part of Withum Advisory. A few words about Withum Smith & Brown, if you guys are not familiar with us. Withum is a top 25 public accounting firm. We have about 1,100 employees located across 15 offices on the East Coast of the United States. I am physically located in our Washington, D.C. office, just outside of D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland. And I have over more than 15 years of experience around digital transformation, specifically on the Microsoft Cloud and on-premise platform with Office 365, SharePoint, Microsoft Dynamics, Azure, Power BI. And I'm really excited to be on this webinar today to talk about some of the upcoming concerns and challenges with GDPR. So with this, I'm going to turn to Anupam, who's here on the call with me.
Hello, everyone. This is Anupam. I'm a senior manager in Withum Smith & Brown's Princeton office in New Jersey. I mainly work with practice areas relating to internal controls, risk, and compliance, and do a lot of SSA 18 audits. They are known as SOC audits as well, Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, system audits, and get into cybersecurity risk as well. And today, we want to spend the next an hour or so talking about GDPR. And our agenda for today is one, introduce our participants to GDPR. There's a lot of buzz in the market about GDPR. GDPR goes into effect May 25, 2018. You know, it's a couple of months down the line almost. And a lot of people are talking now about GDPR. And we are going to talk as to how it is going to impact business, not just now, but in coming years, especially from US standpoint. If your business is in United States with a European exposure, how is this going to impact you? What are the best practices that you can do to make sure you can be compliant? And again, a lot of businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses, do use Microsoft technology. And Daniel is again going to speak a little bit about how you can leverage existing technologies into becoming GDPR compliant. Moving on, so GDPR is essentially a regulation. What it does is that it increases the personal privacy rights. And the way it does is for the individuals and European citizens or residents, it gives certain rights. For the businesses, it increases duties. We know every corresponding right has a corresponding responsibility or a duty going along with it. And in terms of GDPR, that duty rests on organizations and businesses that collect, maintain, and process private data of the European citizens. And the way it is going to enforce this is through penalties. And the penalties are significant enough, as you will see, that would prompt you to take preventive measures and become GDPR compliant. GDPR is a EU regulation, but it has implications beyond EU. OECD came up with this regulation that got adopted by the European Parliament, and it has a term called data subjects. Data subjects is basically living and identifiable or identified individuals. So key here with GDPR is that we are talking about data which is about individuals. We are not talking about intellectual property rights or other data that belongs to businesses and has commercial implications. That brings us to our polling question 1.
Looks like people are still voting a little bit. Thanks for participating.
And a reminder that to get your CPE credit, you should respond here. So we got percentage 80% have voted.
Yep.
All right. So for the most part, people think they have exposure. Some say no, and we certainly will want to challenge those people that say no, and the folks that are not sure. Hopefully, after today's webinar, we'll know more about that.
Right. So
right.
Right. Sitting across the Atlantic, we always think, that why should we worry about European Union regulations? So GDPR or data protection in EU, the regulation around those data protection rights are not new. The first two stages in 1980 and 1995, which kind of set the stage for current GDPR, they were more like voluntary best practices that many businesses in Europe adopted. And as e-commerce gained momentum and as electronic health records gained, prevalence in our society, and as everything just happens digitally nowadays, EU is concerned about its citizens' privacy. Everybody knows the headlines we get nowadays about cybersecurity breaches. So, technically, can somebody take your fingerprint image and play around with it and become one of you? So those are the concerns. So the government there has tried to step in and come up with a little more standard protection and regulation. Now, EU obviously did it much significantly, but there have been data protection regulations in Australia as well as recently I just heard that SEC came out in United States came out with some disclosure requirements when it comes to cybersecurity breaches. So a regulation is there, it's going to come, and what regulation does, it basically, it kind of brings data beyond IT. It brings all attorneys, business process people, everybody together. Moving on.
Anupam, if I can add something here, what we find interesting is that the EU didn't give any of their organization too much time. Well, when we think about it, it's less than 2 years since the regulation was adopted, and here we are in 2018 with a looming deadline of less than 2 years for organizations to be compliant. And I think in the EU, probably people are more ahead, but around the world, it's certainly lagging behind.
Right. So the regulation says that if you, as a business in any part of the world, have personal data of EU data subjects, you are expected to be compliant with GDPR requirements. We know that sitting in the United States, we could have data of European Union citizens, whether they are customers, whether they are potential customers, whether they are our employees. So think of an email marketing campaign, or think of doing clinical trials with EU residents, and you are certainly going to collect that data, and that exposes you to GDPR. A lot of times, as we know, that data today stays in cloud, and of the top 10 data centers in the world, the largest ones, 6 to 7, various surveys point out, are in United States. So those data centers, and if your data or the data that your business uses is on those data centers, and you are accessing that every now and then, you probably need to be GDPR compliant, even though you are in European Union, but I'm now hosting the data here. There are a lot of penalties for non-compliance, and I just put 20 million euros today's exchange rate. It's about 24 to 25 million dollars. That's a lot of money to stay and to say that, oh, I'll take this risk and not be compliant. And whether or not EU would have a legal basis to fight you and chase you in the United States, or whether your commercial insurance would help you out in case you get levied with penalties, that only time will tell. GDPR is a regulation that's going to unfold in court of law across the world, and we'll learn more as it goes by. So the best thing is maybe to become compliant, and there are more advantages we'll see later of becoming compliant with GDPR, not just for the regulations, but also from your business operations perspective. So what is the personal data? As you see, it could be anything. Interestingly, if you say your computer IP address is a personal data, most individuals don't even realize that this is something that's shared to have a better browsing experience. But we can think name, SSN numbers, or any other form of identification, license numbers, but this is like a digital personal data that also is now considered personal. That brings us to polling question number 2.
So Anupam, if I can ask a question as people into the poll here. If someone comes to our website to GDPR, correct?
Right, very much. And we have all these cookies in place that collect the computer IP address, right?
Yep.
And if that is really identified to an individual, like somebody just fills out a form on the website and things like that, and we hold and process that information, right, we would be.
Excellent. All right, so we got 65% voted here. We're still going to give a few minutes for folks to continue putting their vote. And what we see so far is GDPR, interesting, stand for Gross Domestic Product Regulation. Not quite. All right, so 78% vote. I think we're going to close the polling here. Okay, so the answer is
number 2.
All right, so the answer is, so people voted 57%, GDPR stands for Gross Domestic Product Regulation. Is that right, Anupam?
That's perfectly right. Right, we are not able to see the screen. I don't know if you can pull that up. But let me spend a minute on this slide. GDPR does extend to paper-based records. So when we think of the GDPR compliance program, we think GDPR is just not about IT. It needs to extend to all employees who use data. Simple as that.
At first I was like, wait, what?
Right. And also, the question about Brexit, United Kingdom has stated that, they will embrace GDPR in principle. So I don't know whether they will adopt GDPR as it is, or they will come out with an equivalent regulation. But again, if you are in UK and obviously you're doing business all over Europe and in United States, or you are in US with operations in all over Europe with an office in UK, it's very obvious that the market is going to tell you, are you GDPR compliant? Then we will do business with you. Otherwise, we will prefer somebody who is GDPR compliant. All right. So let's get into some of the rights that GDPR has granted to these individuals, and those rights would necessarily mean that the businesses would have to implement procedures to comply with this right. So one of the things is the right to access. So I now need to have procedures that if a European Union citizen or a data subject comes and asks me that, can you give me, a copy of the data you collected from me 6 months before when I filled out that form, I'm obligated to give them that data freely. Also, I need to disclose how the data that is being collected will be actually used and for what purpose. So it's a lot of disclosure requirements. I need to have protocol and procedures in place to meet this right.
So I want to challenge everyone in the audience here, Anupam, if I can add something to challenge everyone in the audience. Those rights are important, and more importantly, think about how your IT system is, how you're going to detect and find, where do you store personal information, right? That's probably one of the biggest challenges we can see here.
Right.
Coming.
Right. This is one of the most interesting right that the GDPR regulation has brought out. It's very easy to collect data, maintain it, lock it, and assume it won't be breached. But, when we get data, it comes on our website or it comes through an email, it sits on our hard disk, we print something out, it sits in our table, then we share the data with a third-party provider who is going to process it and give it back to us. So data has a tendency to replicate itself, different versions, and in different locations. So a right of erasure, also known as right to be forgotten, in order to implement this right and comply with it, you will really need to chase your data. You need to know where your data is going to be. And that's the biggest challenge that most companies nowadays face is they really don't know how far that data goes. So again, it's something that you need to think and devise procedures right from inception of the data and kind of identify where it is going to go and put controls in place.
And everyone should think about Excel spreadsheets. Everyone should think about databases. Anyone should think about documents that contain that information, right? If it's a database, well, we're going to assume it's easier to find, but often that document was downloaded to Excel or other documents. So having a comprehensive way to find is critical.
Right, and I also got a question from a client saying, what about my backups? So now I have the data which is live, and then what am I supposed to do with my data backups which are offsite and things like that? So you have to address risks and compliance requirements to those too. The next thing is data portability and conditions of consent. Data portability, think of cell phone number portability. You can technically, as an individual, come and tell, hey, don't erase my data, but transfer it to ABC, from ABC company to XYZ company, especially if you are in the field of banking or wealth management, you're likely to see such a request saying that, hey, I'm just switching my provider, so erase everything that you have for me and put it over there. Consent is basically, we now need an informed consent. Okay, it cannot be assumed. So when people, go up on websites and sign up on the terms of agreement, those terms of agreement need to explicitly say that, this is what we are going to do with your data, and you have all these rights, and if you really wanted to access your data, we have this protocol, please follow this, and things like that. So
we can think that everyone's website, Anupam, we can think that everyone's website, privacy policy should be updated to reflect GDPR at the minimum.
Right. The next one is a game changer for the industry as a whole, which kind of says privacy by design. The moment you're going to design your systems, procedures, databases, programs, you will now have to think in terms of data protection from the EU perspective. Because what the regulation says is, yes, you have all this data, you don't just need to build a wall around it. You basically need to have your controls and procedures in place to meet, appropriate technical and organizational measures and in an effective way. So what an effective way means is, essentially, it's one thing to design also. The next thing is you need to test it also, that it meets those compliance requirements that you believe you need to put in place to be GDPR compliant. So, Daniel, is this something that was at the core of software development, or is it something that's now it's really right in forefront of software development that we have to think of privacy by design?
I want to say that most organizations, when they think about system design, architecture, even selecting a software platform, I think privacy is a stated concern. And I think that what GDPR is telling us is that this needs to come up as a baseline important requirements on any system selection, system build, right? And more importantly, if you're selecting a cloud platform or software as a service, you need to test and challenge the provider on their compliance with GDPR, right? Because that's what this privacy by design means, is when you pick something, make sure it is compliant, and we'll talk about what compliance means, but it means that it has the tool for you to be compliant.
There are, in addition to the rights that the regulation gives, it has certain other requirements cast on the businesses or organizations. Breach notifications, again, the key thing is 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach, okay? It takes a lot of time to become aware of the breach, about almost like 5 to 6 months or 4 to 6 months before an organization comes to know that there was somebody in their system that kind of came in and or is taking advantage of their data through unauthorized access. But the moment you become aware of it, you have a very limited time. It takes a lot of while to come to know as to how much data is breached and in which locations or the kind of data that is breached. So as a precaution, you are at least expected to notify the respective authorities within 72 hours saying, hey, something has happened and we are investigating it. There is a requirement to have a data protection officer. It's a designation. You don't have to really hire somebody, but it's somebody you need to make it in charge as a DPO, as well as there is somebody called data controller and data processor. Those things need to be identified. If you are an HR department that uses an outsourced payroll provider, the HR department is technically let's say the data controller, and the data processor is the payroll processing company. So by virtue of the processor definition, a lot of small and medium-sized businesses which offer services to big multinationals like the Fortune 500, who obviously have taken a lead in GDPR compliance, they would eventually need to be compliant as well. So to summarize this, it's a big regulation, but in terms of what are the key things here, one, it is about personal privacy. That's something every business now needs to think about as to what that personal privacy means and how they are collecting the personal data of individuals. Put in place controls and notifications, and have transparent policies. So these policies are known throughout in the organization, and also as Daniel pointed out, your privacy policy that you put out on your website needs to be GDPR compliant. Now, if you have policies, it's good to have policies, but they need to be effective, and that requires training and some testing within your IT and other functions as well. So this is essentially the GDPR in a nutshell. Before we move on to the next segment, we have a polling question.
All right, so we are starting poll number 3. The question is, GDPR may not apply to the following. All right, so we have 50% voted. I think this one is pretty easy, right? Anupam?
I think so. Right.
All right, we're 82% voting. So what is the answer, Anupam?
It says it may not apply to a local dollar store.
That's correct,
right?
Yes.
That's the least probability. Right. So where do we stand? As I mentioned before, a lot of multinationals have obviously taken steps to be GDPR compliant, but there are still a lot of businesses who have just begun their GDPR preparation. So whether you have begun, you have not begun, or you think you are compliant, GDPR is something that you will have to do on an ongoing basis. So you should start and just begin with it. So at some day you can say and proclaim yourself that yes, we have policies and procedures that make us GDPR compliant. Now, in terms of how do you become GDPR compliant, there are basically 5 broad steps. The first step is data discovery. As we talked before, most people do not know where the data is and in what form and in what shape and what do we collect and where will it go. The second thing is once you know the inventory of your databases, systems, departments, websites, etc., that collect, maintain, process data, you need to think about the existing security measures around them and evaluate if they are in compliance with GDPR requirements. You also need to do an exercise with your third-party providers to see their GDPR readiness or compliance readiness quotient, because you can have a data and you may be GDPR compliant, but your third-party provider, who is technically your agent within legal means, is not GDPR compliant and they have an issue, you could be held liable. Number 4 is basically to come up with your to-do list of how do you become compliant and what are the steps that you need to take. And number 5 is take those steps, which is the remediation. And again, this is something you obviously, the first time you do it, it's a humongous effort, but on an ongoing basis, it's going to get a little easier. And Daniel is going to talk later as some of the how existing technologies can be leveraged for number 5.
And if I can add something, Anupam, here.
Sure.
You know, a lot of our clients or prospective clients we talk to tend to be stuck in number 1, right? That's step 1, but that's often the hardest, right? Is how do we know what we have, right? And then we'll talk about, you know, in a little bit about how do we get past step 1, which, you know, it's hard to get to 5 if you're stuck on 1.
Right. So I'm a small business. You know, one of the attendees requested us specifically to include things on small business. Now, what's small business? Let's say anybody who has not yet taken steps to be GDPR compliant, not those Fortune 500 companies, but small business, 5 employees, 50 employees, 300 employees, right? Do I need to be compliant now? Maybe now, or maybe never. That's something that your business is going to determine. Somebody is going to come knocking at the door that, hey, you process the data of my customers. That customer pool includes data of EU citizens. I want you to be GDPR compliant. And even though you may not have this direct link with a EU data subject, you might have an indirect link through this. So what we tell our folks and our clients and, you know, who we wish well about is GDPR certainly is a regulation. Don't think it like different from any other data protection, because data protection should be any business's priority nowadays. And if you have a lot of things in place, your policies and procedures, you've been doing cybersecurity risk assessments, you've been doing some level of IT auditing, you will have a head start in your GDPR compliance. And even if you don't think you need to be compliant today and you don't have even these basics in place, start acting on them now. The good thing is a lot of products, especially Microsoft products that small business use, they offer or they are having technology which is GDPR compliance, which kind of, again, gives you an edge over others. So Daniel is going to speak a little bit more about how you can use those technologies and kind of speed up your GDPR compliance process.
Right, and Anupam, I think that was a great introduction for all of us that may be novice on compliance around GDPR, right? I think we debunked a bit. We've talked about what that means. I think hopefully people can spell it correctly now and know what the GDPR stands for. More importantly, I think we understand that the implications are far and very broad. And, you know, again, I think that, you know, for business outside of the EU, everyone should be very concerned about the implication that it has. So the good news is we have a lot of tools. I'm going to take you through some practical steps on how to get started across this 5-step approach. You know, at the end, you know, to get to your compliance, you need to do a few things. One is simplify your privacy journey, right? If you have, you know, hundreds of systems, it's hard because now you have to go look elsewhere. So, you know, you should look at standardizing in a few systems. If you're not in the cloud, we highly recommend that you consider the cloud. Why? Because most cloud systems nowadays are built for privacy, have, because of their scale, been already, thought about the impacts, right? So solutions such as the Microsoft Cloud, and we'll talk a lot more about this, will take you a few steps further in your compliance. Also, you have to look at uncovering the risk and take some actions, right? And for that, you're going to need some compliance technology solution that will expose the area of risk, right? It's hard to know what you don't know if you don't have a tool to figure it out, right? And, again, a lot of the cloud software providers are taking great steps to help you uncover the risk. And then lastly, it's hard to do this alone, right? Like any technology journey, because GDPR has a very strong technology implication, we'll recommend that you leverage the guidance from experts. Obviously, Anupam and a lot of our advisory team members on the compliance side have been trained, have followed GDPR for a long time, and will help you meet both from a practical standpoint, from a policy standpoint, from a technology standpoint, will help you in your GDPR journey. So how do I get started? We've laid out this 5-step approach. I'm going to take you through all of those: discover, manage what you have, help you protect, right? A big aspect of GDPR that's not often known is what do you do in the area of a breach, right? So a good way to avoid breaches is to be very well protected, right? So we see a lot of organizations are thinking about ways to meet GDPR compliance is do everything you can in your possession to avoid a breach. So now you're not subject to those potential penalties and remediation in case of a breach, right? So protection and thinking about security is top in mind in 2018 for a lot of organizations for that reason. And lastly, keep good set of reports so that you can manage the data and the request and be able to report on breaches and notifications. So if you think, and again, our team at Withum Digital do a lot of work in the Microsoft ecosystem. I've highlighted here a few of the Microsoft Cloud product, Office 365, Dynamics, EMS, Azure, SQL, Windows servers. Those are all solutions that Microsoft for the past 2 years have worked on and enable and stated the state of GDPR compliance by using the Microsoft toolset. I'll go into more detail in a few minutes, but if you are on the Microsoft Cloud and you're considering moving to the Microsoft Cloud, there are great tools and capabilities that are provided by one or a combination of those products to allow you to get and gain compliance, and more importantly, be able to report in that event and really help with step one, which is discover what you have. So with that, we're going to move on to a poll. We'll be interested to see how many in the audience have currently using Microsoft Office 365. So just say yes, no. Some may not be sure. So about 60% so far who voted, or 60%-ish, 55 say yes, 34% say no. Those that says no, obviously, moving to Office 365 will get you a step ahead from a compliance and discovery. And we're going to talk about
Daniel,
those
capabilities. This is the cloud-based version of
Office 365 is the Microsoft communication and collaboration platform that's in the cloud. And when we talk about the cloud, I think that, I've studied that earlier, that being in the cloud is already a step forward in the right direction. Why? Because a lot of those compliance capability only exist in the Microsoft world in the cloud, right? They can help you protect your on-premise or your your security that's hosted in a data center, in a private data center, but the compliance solution sits in the cloud, right? So, let's think about discovery for a moment here. Discovery is about identifying what personal data you have, and second, once you've identified, to know where it is. So what's in scope is any data that helps you identify a person, name, email addresses, physical, medical information, location, bank, IP address is big, right? Because every cookie on a website or every cookie on a software as a service system is personal information, and things such as cultural identity, right? So that's in scope. And then you have to inventory where that personal data is stored, right? Email, documents, databases, removal of media, sometimes metadata, data about the data that's stored somewhere that you may not be aware of, log files, right? A lot of systems that you may have customized or built have tons of other log files that identify an error or mistake or a bug or something that has a tendency to contain a personal data, often usage or analytics about people visiting may contain personal information, backups, of course. So think about it, the scope is very, very broad here. So in the Microsoft world, think about if you use Azure, Microsoft has something called the data catalog, which essentially collects a lot of information that is subject to GDPR and will contain private and personal data. The Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite, which is a tool that helps you be compliant and ensure that your systems are secure, that you can detect breaches and so forth. Dynamics 365, which is a CRM and ERP system, obviously will contain tremendous amount of audit data and user activity. And if it's only used internally, that's one thing, but a lot of those systems in Dynamics have external capability to bring your customer or your partners. And likely you have people in the EU that will be subject to GDPR. The reporting and analytics tool will have contain some of those private information. Office and Office 365 has obviously a lot of content. I'm thinking about Excel. People download a list of their visitors to their website in Excel. It's floating here, stored in your OneDrive document. I can tell you it's not going to be easy to find those unless you have tools that are part of the compliance center of Office 365, such as data loss prevention, which allows you to detect private information, even down to social security number, credit card, bank. Not only it allows you to detect that, it allows you to prevent storing any of that information in a personal OneDrive file that's unsecure. The advanced data governance capability, which protects that information. This capability in Office 365 and Azure that allows you to protect information by encrypting private content, by forcing private content to be secure with keys and password and additional information to prevent an email that contains personal information to be printed or forwarded. All of that exists in Office 365. Lastly, this e-discovery capability, that's very important when you are subject of a breach and need to discover, right? Your lawyers or attorneys will want to make sure that you have a tool where you can query across all of your system, not email, not just documents, but anything in Office 365 to find what you have. Obviously, many of you use databases hosted on Microsoft platform or Oracle platform or other platforms. The SQL query language is a tool that you can use to find and discover. There's a lot of advances there where in most of modern databases today, you can issue broad queries to look across a multitude of tables. And obviously, any search engine, we tend to forget those. Any search engine will have a lot of data about your people, right? And that's yet another database that contains that information, right? So I don't want to scare everyone, but think about the scope here is already very large. So, again, using cloud system will help you in that discovery exercise. All right, moving on to the management, right? So once you discover, you put procedure in place, right? You want to be able to govern your data, right? And that's again where cloud solutions such as the Microsoft Cloud has components of it, right? And I've touched on some of those already to allow you to protect and govern that private information. Azure Active Directory and information protection and the role-based access control allow you to lock down system, right, so that you're securing access to that information and avoid breaches. The ability to archive and retain content and set up policies, right? One of the risks that many businesses faces today is not having a retention policy, right? People keep files forever, right? So, as good compliance and consultants will advise you to think about your data retention policies across email and documents and databases. How long should you keep content, right? Most organizations may have a stated policy, but they do nothing with it. Maybe we'll keep it for 3 years, and after 3 years, we delete them. I can tell you that here at Withum, to avoid compliance issue, we have a policy to delete emails that are older than 1 year, right? And that's purposely done so, we don't get into trouble of hosting data that could be, in the event of a breach, access to, right? So that's, again, thinking about retention as a means to avoid hosting and keeping too much data. So a lot of those cloud system, again, will have a lot of journaling and data governance capability to help you govern, but also classify that information. So that easily I can say, I need a query to show me all the documents in my organization that contain private information, and private information being declared as email, social security number, and so forth. So that's about managing your content. Number 3 is about protection, right? Again, this is a proactive measure that every business should take, right? Remember that one of the key aspects of GDPR is about a quick, fast reaction in the event of a breach. Again, we do have a team here at Withum that help in cybersecurity, right? Why? Because cybersecurity is a key concern that you can solve a lot of GDPR compliance by avoiding breaches. So preventing attacks, again, a lot of folks may think that you're in the cloud, you're more vulnerable. We're all gonna advise against this perception. Most cloud systems are more secure than what you have on premise for most small or medium businesses, right? Network security and identity management are key elements that you can put in place to prevent attack. And then if you do have something happening, you need to be able to monitor and respond to those breaches. If you look at the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem, specifically on Office 365, which 60% of you have said you own, there's an additional capability called Advanced Threat Protection. Microsoft just recently released, as early as about 2 weeks ago, a new tool to simulate attacks and help you simulate an attacker trying to penetrate your Office 365 system and essentially simulate attacks and see how your user will react. So, in the past, you needed to hire a consulting firm to do it. Now it's available, and those capability are becoming available in the Microsoft ecosystem, specifically in Office 365. So, again, to avoid a lot of those concerns, look at what you have. If you use Microsoft technology, make sure your database is all encrypted, right, with strong keys. Any personal information should be encrypted in the database so that if someone were to access your SQL Server, they couldn't get the data without a decryption key, right? I can tell you that most of our clients don't think about even encrypted credit card number, which has been a requirement here in the US for a very long time. and then look at ways to defend yourself, right? Implement modern technology. If you're using an old operating system, if you're not using Windows 10 Enterprise, you're missing a lot from a protection of the endpoint, which is the device. And then in the cloud, obviously, Azure has things such as key vaults, which is a very highly secure area to protect encryption keys and username and password. And even the storage services on Azure now allow encryption, right? So that you have more capability. And then moving on to step number 4, reporting tools, right? So you discover your data, you put procedure in place to manage it and govern it. You made step ahead to be able to report on it. Now, how do you do it, right? If you use capability here, the idea is to be able to record access to that data, right? And that's sometimes where you need to go above and beyond, right? Maybe if you have a cloud system, you need to turn on some additional recording and logging capability, right? With Office 365, it tends to be turned on by default. But with Dynamics, for instance, you don't have all the logging in place automatically, right? You have to turn those on. But once that's on, you need to also monitor that and audit, right? So you need to have appointed folks in your, maybe your IT department or elsewhere, or your compliance department to constantly look, monitor, use the tool to your disposal to look at what's available, and maybe create a reporting solution, right? A dashboard that shows you, things that are of concern, maybe unusual activity, maybe a rise of storage or personal information into a OneDrive system or a SharePoint site of such, right? So reporting is becoming critical. And again, most of the modern cloud solutions have lots of availability here. And I suspect we're going to see product popping out left and right from a compliance standpoint that will help you aggregate this from not only the Microsoft cloud, but from other cloud as well. So with that, I think we will want to take a few questions. All right, so what questions do we have here? Question number 1. Okay, so that's a question I think that we have covered, but I'm going to spend more time on it. Anupam, if I'm not based in the EU, does this regulation affect me, and if yes, in what capacity?
Right now, what we see, if you are not based in EU, but the question you have to ask is, number 1, do you collect, maintain, or process any data relating to an EU resident? That's the you need to ask. If you expect yourself to be in that situation, you need to become GDPR compliant. Now, as we discussed before, whether EU, OECD, or any other regulatory authority in EU would come here and try to establish jurisdiction, that is unlikely. Can they still send you a notice? Yes. Would you be subject to some legal process? Maybe, maybe not. That's an attorney question, and it will unfold itself. But what we see in the marketplace is basically when you work with somebody who is based in EU, they are going to ask you that we will do business with you as long as you can assure us that you are GDPR compliant. So you need to evaluate your own personal organizational situation and determine that based on the data that I collect, or based on, let's say 3 years down the line, I want to expand in Europe and I want to have an office in Europe or things like that. It's a strategic decision that you would need to make. And yes, if you have that exposure, I would strongly suggest you should take procedures to be compliant.
That's a great answer, Anupam. I appreciate that. And that's a good segue to question number 2, which is, what should I do if I'm not ready by May 25th, 2018, which happens to be a few months from now? And specifically, I'm not based in the EU. I'm doing business with organizations in the EU, which may push me to be required to be compliant. So what should people do?
Right. So in those situations, one, the best thing you have to do is manage the expectations of your stakeholders. Now, if you are in Europe, you have an expectation from the OECD or your data protection authority, which is the local authority that's going to govern this in each country. So you have an obligation over there or an expectation with them. If you are in United States, determine who has expectations of you in order to be like GDPR compliant. And maybe it's your customers in EU or your partner in EU that expects you to be GDPR compliant. In that case, I would suggest that you have a dialogue with them saying that, hey, I realize that I have to be GDPR compliant by May 25th. I do not think so. I will be in a position to do so. However, I have initiated steps and procedures that will make me GDPR compliant in coming months. And is there a risk that you have now, because of me not being GDPR compliant, and let's take steps to address that risk, you want to adopt a no surprise approach with all your stakeholders who expect yourself to be GDPR compliant.
Great point. Yeah. Question number 3 here, is there a concern with regard to the business size, right? So an example, I'm a business with 50 people. I collect and maybe will get people from EU to visit my website or register for something. Should I be concerned if I'm a small business too?
If depends on what you want to do with the data. There is 250 employee kind of count that the EU has contemplated to be a threshold, but that only applies to a data controller level. And the moment you become a data processor, there is no count. So even if you are a single shop enterprise which processes data, okay, you may still want to have policies and procedures in place.
So that's a great point. So if I am a cloud provider and I'm a small business, but I do process data as a business, it doesn't matter my size, I have to be compliant. Now, if I'm a small business and just collect data for whatever reason, and I have maybe one customer in the UK, and I'm small, there is a 50 employee limit.
Right. Talk to if it's just one customer you have in UK, and if it's not your significant customer, I would still have a dialogue with them saying that, hey, we know about this regulation, just wanting to let you know that we may not have formal procedures around it. But as I said earlier in some of the slides, whether you need to be GDPR compliant or not, you need to have protection in place for any data that you have. So you should be able to demonstrate to that partner or customer saying that I have not specifically mapped everything to GDPR, but I'm very confident that I have enough policies and procedures in place. I have been through IT audits, or I have been through a pen testing, and all those bells and whistles are in place in my system that would support a lot of GDPR compliance.
Great. We have a lot of questions asking us about what about non-Microsoft cloud systems, such as Amazon Web Services, Google. Well, I can tell you that they're all, working in the same manner. AWS has, like Microsoft, issued white papers and guidance on their website. Microsoft has a whole slew of resources as well, such as AWS. So is AWS as well. And you'll find that most of the large cloud providers, Salesforce, Google, have issued guidance or is issuing guidance on how to use their system for GDPR. Just Google the name GDPR and the SaaS product, and you'll see statements on compliance, and how can this tool help you if you use one of those tools. Last question here, and we're going to run out of time, is, it's a great question. Somebody's asking, if you want to encrypt data for protection, do you need to encrypt everything, right? Or, can you keep the IP address unencrypted but hide the name? That's a great question. And I think that, from an encryption best practice standpoint, more is better. Certainly, there's information that people may feel like they're not significant, or they won't help you detect who you are. Well, IP address is one of those where you can trace back specifically the computer, the location, and everything else. So it is highly private. It's one that is to be concerned with, just for the sake of, if someone gets access to your customer IP address, they could run and use that to attack their computer, right? And you don't want to be the person that disclosed their IP, and all of a sudden those people have been attacked because they found the IP address on your system, right? You'll be liable and as well. So IP address, yes, should be highly protected as well. All right, so last and not least, we want to thank you all for joining us today. We'll encourage you to visit our website, digital.withum.com. We have a lot of GDPR compliance resources here. We'll send you the link. If you're concerned about your state of preparation, want to have just a conversation with myself, Anupam, and many of our other experts on the compliance side, we'll send you a link where you can schedule a free consultation. We'll have a talk. We'll review what system you're using, and we'll give you some hints and ideas on how to get started in this compliance journey. Remember that May 25th isn't the end. It's actually the beginning. It's the beginning of time where you all need to start being compliant and prepare yourself for what's ahead. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Anupam, for this great introduction to what GDPR means.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you all.